Amina woke in Merulo hoping for peace, but the air felt heavy before she even reached the living room. Joran was already pacing, opening and shutting drawers like he was fighting ghosts only he could see. She tried to speak, soft and careful, but he snapped first, sharp enough to make her step back. By evening the tension broke like a branch in a storm. He accused her of taking things she never touched, things that lived only in his own fear. She stood there stunned, trying to calm the room with steady breath, but his words kept rising until he pointed at the door and told her to leave with nothing. Her hands trembled as she packed only what she could carry. A few clothes, her journal, a photo of her mother. She almost walked out right then, but something pulled her upstairs. On the top shelf sat the folder with the documents for his dream project in Arendo. Without them, he would be lost. She didn't know why she cared, but she took the folder anyway. The night outside felt too big as she walked along Lake Mary, the moon shivering on the water. She sank onto a stone and let the hurt spread through her chest, slow and quiet. Later, when Joran called in panic, she answered with a voice gentler than he deserved. She agreed to meet him only if he spoke without shouting. When they sat across from each other in a small Dazuri tea house, she gave him the folder and told him the truth he had refused to hear. He apologized, soft and shaken. She stood and left before he found more words. Under the streetlights, walking toward the buses, she felt a new strength rise in her like dawn. She hadn't left with nothing. She left with herself. By the time the sun slipped behind the red roofs of Merulo, the whole house felt tight, as if it already knew what was coming. Amina had spent the day walking on quiet feet, hoping the morning's tension would fade, but Joran's anger only grew heavier, like clouds that refused to release their rain. It finally burst over something so small she couldn't even remember it later. One second he was speaking fast, the next he was shouting, accusing her of taking pieces of his life she never even touched. Emotional things, money things, even the dreams he kept tucked inside his chest. She tried to answer with a steady voice, tried to remind him they once laughed in this same room, but her words only sharpened his rage. His voice bounced off the walls until the whole house felt like it was shaking. Then he pointed at the door, his hand trembling, and he told her to leave with nothing. For a moment she just stood there, her breath caught like a small bird in her throat. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because she couldn't believe how fast love could turn into something that burned. She walked to their bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The room looked the same as always, but it no longer felt like hers. She opened the closet and took only a few clothes. She picked up her journal, still warm from the morning sun that had fallen across it, and a photo of her mother that always smelled faintly of old paper. Her hands shook so much she had to sit on the edge of the bed for a moment. She kept thinking of how many times she had held this home together with quiet patience, how many times she had swallowed her own hurt to keep peace alive. Now it was like the house itself was pushing her out. She almost walked straight to the door, but something made her pause. A thought fluttered in her chest and led her upstairs to the small study Joran rarely visited anymore. On the top shelf sat the leather folder containing all the documents for his long-awaited business permit in Arendo. She stared at it for a long time. Without it, he would be stuck. All his plans, all his sacrifices, all the nights he stayed awake dreaming of a better life, would fall apart. She knew he couldn't find the updated copies without her. Part of her wanted to leave the folder where it was, to let him feel the weight of what he had done. But another part, the part that still believed in the goodness he used to carry, reached up and took it gently. She walked out of the house into the cool night. The air tasted different, sharper, almost new. Merulo's lamps glowed in long lines along the paths, guiding her toward the lake. When she reached the water, she sat on a stone and watched the moon break into pieces across the waves. She breathed slowly until the trembling eased. It hurt, all of it, but beneath the hurt she felt something shifting, something she didn't have a name for yet. She looked at the folder in her lap and let out a soft, tired laugh. Joran had told her to leave with nothing, but he had forgotten the one thing he still needed. And as she rose to her feet and followed the quiet road away from the house, Amina realized she carried something far more important than papers. She carried the strength to walk away, and the strange, gentle hope that her story was not ending but opening into a new place she had yet to see. Amina walked into the bedroom as if it were suddenly a stranger's space, though her scarf still hung on the chair and Joran's shoes still sat neatly by the wall. She moved slowly, touching only what she needed, taking a few clothes she could fold small, the journal where she kept the quiet pieces of her heart, and the photo of her mother that always felt like a hand on her shoulder. Her hands shook so much she had to press them against her thighs just to steady them. The air felt thick, and every soft sound seemed too loud. She kept thinking about how love had once carried her into this house with warm laughter and the smell of new paint, how it had wrapped around her like a blanket on cold nights, and how suddenly it had snapped like a rope pulled too tight for too long. She almost smiled at the thought of how life sometimes turned without warning, the kind of small smile that comes with disbelief rather than joy. She zipped her bag and took one last look at the bed where so many dreams were whispered and so many evenings passed in silence. She almost walked out right then, wanting only the night air and the freedom beyond the door, but a memory flickered at the edge of her mind, something important, something she had forgotten in the panic. She climbed the stairs to the study, her footsteps slow and soft, as if she didn't want the house to notice her leaving. The study smelled of old paper and dust from the open window. On the top shelf sat the leather folder, dark and worn at the edges. Inside were the updated documents for Joran's business permit in Arendo, the one she had spent weeks helping him organize. She remembered the small smile he had once given her when he talked about his dream, the way he believed the project would change their future. She stood there for a long moment, the folder almost glowing in the dim light. Part of her wanted to leave it exactly where it was. Let him search. Let him feel the loss. But another part, the part that still held a quiet softness despite everything, reached for it with careful fingers. The weight of it surprised her. It felt heavier than paper, as if it carried every late night, every hope, every moment she had supported him even when he didn't see it. She slipped it into her bag and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. When she walked back down the stairs, the house seemed quieter, almost listening. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. She thought of her mother's photo tucked safely in her bag and felt a small warmth spread through her chest. Maybe strength didn't always roar. Maybe sometimes it trembled. She stepped outside into the cool Merulo night, the sky wide above her, and the scent of the lake drifting through the breeze. As the door clicked shut behind her, she felt something shift inside her, a soft but steady reminder that even in heartbreak there could be a strange kind of hope waiting just ahead. Amina stood in the doorway of the study for a long moment, letting her eyes move across the shelves the way they used to when she was helping Joran plan his future. The room felt still, as if holding its breath. Dust floated through the golden light from the small window, and the smell of old paper wrapped around her like a familiar coat she no longer wished to wear. On the top shelf sat the leather folder, dark and worn, the one Joran guarded like treasure during the early days of his dream. She remembered how he used to run his fingers over it and talk about Arendo, the rising city where he believed everything was possible. He had spent years saving, learning, and sacrificing to get to this point. It almost made her smile to think of how excited he used to be, how he once pulled her into a slow dance in this very room when they received the first approval letter. But now, the memory stung more than it warmed. The folder held the updated documents he needed to finalize the project, the ones only she knew how to arrange. Without them, he would search for hours, maybe days, tearing apart every drawer in the house. She reached up and touched the folder with fingertips that still trembled from the fight. She heard his voice again, harsh and sharp, telling her to leave with nothing. For a second, she felt the burn of his words rise in her chest, hot and unfair. Why should she help him now? Why should she carry the weight of his future when he had thrown hers aside so carelessly? The thought made her shake her head in disbelief, almost a soft laugh at how strange the heart could be. But as she held the folder, another feeling crept in, quieter than anger, gentler than pride. She remembered the long nights they worked together, the meals she brought him when he forgot to eat, the excitement in his eyes when he explained his vision for Arendo's new market district. Those moments were real too, and they sat somewhere deep in her, even now. Helping him wouldn't fix the hurt. It wouldn't erase the shouting or the way he pointed at the door. But it also didn't take anything away from her. It only showed who she was, even when he couldn't see her clearly. She pulled the folder down and held it against her chest. It was heavier than she expected, as if it carried not just paper but every sacrifice they had made together. She placed it gently in her bag, next to the photo of her mother and her journal. As she walked out of the study, she felt the house echo behind her, quiet and uncertain. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the hum of the evening wind slipping through a cracked window. Something inside her shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of steady calm that surprised her. She realized she wasn't helping him because he deserved it in this moment. She was helping because she deserved to leave with her truth intact, with her compassion unbroken. When she stepped outside into the cooling Merulo night, the folder pressed against her side like a reminder of who she still was beneath all the pain, and she felt a small spark of strength rising softly, carefully, ready to guide her toward whatever came next. Amina stepped into the cool Merulo night and felt the air wrap around her like a thin cloak, light but steady enough to keep her standing. The world outside seemed too wide, almost frightening in its quiet, as if it was waiting to see what she would do next. She closed the door gently behind her, not wanting the sound to echo back into the life she was leaving. For a moment she stood still on the small stone porch, touching the strap of her bag the way a child might hold a familiar toy while walking into the dark. Then she took a slow breath and began walking toward the lake. The path curved through soft grass, and the lamps along the way flickered as if whispering encouragement. When she reached the water, the moon lay across it in sharp pieces, like a broken plate someone had tried to put back together. She sat on a flat rock and pulled her legs close, feeling the cold through her clothes, letting it clear the fog inside her. The heartbreak in her chest didn't shout or burn. It settled quietly, heavy but patient, like something that knew it would soften with time. She looked at her reflection trembling on the surface and almost laughed at how unfamiliar she seemed. A woman with shaking hands yet strangely steady eyes. The lake had always been her place for thinking, a hidden corner where she had whispered dreams to the wind, and once even joked with Joran about buying a small boat when life got easier. The memory stung, but she let it pass through her instead of holding it. She touched her bag lightly, knowing the folder inside had the power to decide Joran's future. It was strange to walk away with something so important to him, something he never imagined she would carry. He had told her to leave with nothing, but here she was with her essentials, her mother's photo, her journal, and the one thing he would soon be desperate to find. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel cruel. She felt something deeper, a quiet dignity rising through the cracks inside her. Helping him had not broken her. It had reminded her that she could still choose who she wanted to be, even in the middle of pain. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and the moonlight painted her in silver. She let out a soft sigh, not of sadness but of understanding. Maybe she wasn't walking away from her life as much as she was walking back to herself. She stayed by the lake until the chill reached her bones, then stood slowly, her heart a little calmer. As she began the long walk toward the northern side of Merulo, where she knew she could catch a late bus if she needed one, she felt the heaviness shift inside her. It didn't disappear, but it made space for something else, a small warmth that grew with each step. She wasn't leaving with nothing. She carried her dignity, her kindness, her strength, and the proof that even broken nights can lead to brighter places. And in the silence of that wide, waiting world, she realized she was not as alone as she thought. Hours after Amina left, the house in Merulo turned into a storm without wind. Joran moved from room to room, pulling open drawers, scattering papers, knocking over chairs he didn't mean to knock over. The anger that had burned so bright earlier now mixed with something colder, something that made his hands clumsy. He searched the study twice, then a third time, his breath growing sharp as he realized the leather folder wasn't there. The truth struck him hard. Without those updated documents, his dream in Arendo would collapse before it even began. For a moment he just stood in the middle of the study, staring at the shelves as if the folder might magically reappear. Then he grabbed his phone. He meant to call Amina and demand answers, to speak with the same hard voice he'd been using for weeks. But when she answered, everything inside him stumbled. Her voice was steady, so quiet he had to lean into the silence to hear her. He could hear the tiredness behind every word, the soft kind of hurt that didn't need to scream to be understood. Something in him cracked at the sound, small but real, like a thin wall breaking. She told him she had the folder. He felt a rush of relief that almost made him sink to the floor, but before he could raise his voice or twist his words the way he usually did, she spoke again. Her tone didn't shake. She wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was simply done with shouting. She told him she would return the folder, but only if he met her in person and spoke to her like a human being, without raising his voice, without blaming, without turning their marriage into a battlefield again. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched so far he could hear his own heartbeat in it. It amazed him, how her calm carried more weight than all his shouting ever did. He tried to speak, but the edge in his voice crumbled before it reached his tongue. He managed only a quiet yes, surprised at how foreign it felt to answer her softly. After they hung up, he sat on the floor beside the scattered papers. The house no longer felt like a place he controlled. It felt like a mirror showing him everything he didn't want to see. The broken order, the echoes of his own anger, the absence of the woman who had held their life together with quiet strength. He thought of Amina sitting somewhere in Merulo or maybe beyond it, holding the folder with steady hands even though he had shaken her spirit. He didn't know if she still cared for him, or if this meeting was only a final act of kindness before she vanished from his life. But he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear of losing more than documents, fear of losing the last soft connection between them. When he finally stood, he did so slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter the fragile resolve forming inside him. He looked around the ruined room and understood that the folder wasn't the only thing missing. Little pieces of her care had been disappearing for months, slipping away each time he raised his voice. And now, for the first time in months, he felt the weight of that loss settle on him like a truth he could no longer outrun. Joran reached the tea house in Dazuri long before he was ready. The place sat on a corner where the street quieted into soft shadows, and warm lanterns glowed through the windows like patient eyes. He paused outside, rubbing his palms against his trousers the way a boy might before admitting a secret. When he finally stepped in, the smell of ginger and warm milk drifted around him. Amina was there already, sitting by the window, her bag beside her, her posture calm in a way that made his chest tighten. She looked up when he approached, not cold, not angry, simply steady, as if she had made peace with her own heart long before he walked through the door. He sat across from her, preparing himself for accusations, for tears, for the kind of confrontation he felt he deserved. Instead, she reached into her bag and placed the leather folder on the table between them. Her hand didn't shake. It was the first thing he noticed. The second was how quiet the room felt, almost like the world was giving them one last moment to understand each other. Amina didn't raise her voice. She didn't speak quickly. She didn't remind him of every mistake or every sharp word. She simply told him how deeply his shouting had cut into her, how each argument had chipped away at the home she used to feel safe in. She spoke of the weight she had carried alone, the practical things, the emotional things, the invisible things no one else saw. She spoke as if she were finally setting down something heavy she had held for far too long. And as she talked, Joran felt his own anger shrink into something small and embarrassed. He had expected to defend himself, but there was nothing to defend. Listening to her was like holding a mirror he had avoided for months. He saw the man he had become, the one who forgot softness, the one who believed raising his voice meant he was in control. Amina didn't cry, but her calmness held more truth than any tears could. When she finished, silence settled between them like a slow breath. Joran stared at the folder, then at her face, and for the first time in months he spoke without a hard edge. His apology came out uneven, almost unfamiliar, the voice of someone who had finally realized he was breaking the very thing he claimed to love. He apologized for the shouting, for the fear he had caused, for the way he had pushed her aside while chasing a dream she had helped him build. His words were soft, as though he worried they might crumble if he spoke too loudly. Amina listened, her eyes steady, and even though she didn't smile, he saw something gentle return to her expression, a softness that didn't promise anything but didn't shut him out either. When she stood to leave, she lifted her bag with ease as if a great weight had been taken from it. He didn't ask her to stay. He knew this moment wasn't about saving the marriage. It was about seeing her clearly, maybe for the first time in years. As she stepped out into the Dazuri evening, the lanterns catching the edges of her hair, Joran felt something shift inside him. Not a sudden miracle, not a fix, just the quiet realization that love wasn't gone. It was simply waiting for him to grow into someone who deserved it. Amina stepped out of the tea house before Joran could reach for another word, letting the warm light behind her fade as she walked into the cool Dazuri evening. The street smelled of roasted maize and distant rain, and the lamps above her hummed softly like they were guiding her somewhere new. She didn't know what would happen to their marriage, didn't know if the apology she had just heard would grow into real change or disappear like smoke by morning. But she knew one thing with a clarity that felt almost bright inside her. She had walked away with her dignity. She had protected his dream even when he had crushed hers without thinking, and strangely, that gave her a sense of power she hadn't felt in months. As she made her way toward the bus station, her steps light on the uneven pavement, she felt something rising inside her, quiet but warm, like the first sun touching the lake in Merulo at dawn. She thought about the folder in his hands now, the way he had looked at her as though seeing her for the first time in a long while. She thought about the girl she had once been, full of hope, and the woman she had grown into, carrying strength she never expected to need. A soft laugh slipped out of her, surprised and gentle, because even through the heartbreak she felt a strange kind of freedom. She hadn't left with nothing. She left with her self-respect held steady in her chest, and with the knowledge that sometimes the thing someone needs most is the thing they had no right to ask for. When the bus lights appeared at the end of the road, she lifted her chin and stepped forward, ready for whatever waited on the other side of the journey.